Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
Michael Dismuke. You may know me from Continuing Conversations, which is, of course, another podcast that's all about Star Trek Adventures RPG, and Continuing Missions, which is the #1 fan site for Star Trek Adventures RPG. Of course, I'm also a freelance writer for Star Trek Adventures, as is.
How's it going, guys? Al Spader, freelance writer, working a lot with the Star Trek Adventures franchise. Been working on several books now and some digital releases as well.
All right, excellent, excellent. And I'm so glad that have a chance to talk to you both here, talking about Star Trek Adventures, the role-playing game, the horror aspects. How do you add elements of horror to Star Trek? And just to let people know that this is not, we're not going to go anything too gory, so don't worry. We're not going to. This is still PG. There are elements of horror, I would say, but that's just it. It doesn't go anywhere too harsh, I would say. Would you both agree to that?
Totally. I think one of the things is people sometimes mistake what horror is. That always has to do with gore, and it doesn't. Sometimes it does, and that can be scary in itself. But Star Trek over the generations, since it came out in the 60s, has had horror elements in many of the best episodes that we like. I mean, and so it was so great, Manny, when you brought this up. I started doing a little research, and as I started scrolling through the horror episodes, I was like, oh, these are some of my favorites. So I was glad you brought this subject up.
Yeah, I think people mistake Star Trek as a series that I don't know. I think when people first hear Star Trek, they think it's a very intellectual show, and it's a good conversation about ethics and morality. There's all of that, But there's once in a while there's just some episodes that we really like figure out. I don't know, even though this was meant to be horror, the episodes with the Borg, that blew my mind. I was like, what is this? And it was just unstoppable force that and then when Picard was captured and we weren't sure he was coming back next season, that terrified me.
Yeah, I think one of the key components of horror, especially when we're talking in science fiction, is the change to your normal routine, whether that be through like some type of psychic manipulation or some new threat that you aren't familiar with, changing the laws of physics. Things like that can all be attributed to a horror type story, because really horror it's more like a plot than necessarily an individual thing that you're adding to an episode. Horror films have several different types of plots that they follow, and I think every one of them can be applicable in a sci-fi setting.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna just to kind of frame it a little bit too, is think about some non-Star Trek shows that are horror, but they're not necessarily gory, but you're on the edge of your seat, and that could be something like I always think about Kathy Bates in Misery, where you're just terrified, and just one scene of the key trying to get into the door is freaking you out, and is she coming home? And so that kind of stuff actually plays in a lot of Star Treks where you don't know what's around the corner, or you don't know what's out to get you. And that in RPG terms, I know for Al plays in one of my games, it's when your players don't know what's coming is when you have horror. It doesn't necessarily need to be an axe murderer. It's just that sense of dread that does take some skill to weave into an RPG.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So when you're running a game of Star Trek and you want to add those elements of tension a bit, where do you go? Like, what do you watch or read things first, or like where does your mind go when you prepare adventures like these?
You want to go first, Al, or you want me to?
Well, I would just, I would make sure that first my group knows what the expectations are. And if you build a level of trust with your group, there are things that you can do that maybe you wouldn't be able to do if you're just sitting down with someone for the first time at a convention, for example. I think that you always want to get consensus on what people are comfortable with before you decide what you want to do. Because if multiple people at your table aren't okay with mind control, for example, and that was something that you were going to put in, that might be something that you want to shy away from. I like, personally, when I'm developing the sense of this dread, like twisting the laws of physics and making things not normal, because that puts a sense of unease in everyone because they don't know the immediate answer.
Yeah, are they will? And the thing is, are your players willing to trust you with a game that might not have the standard Star Trek happy ending? I think about a story, one of my favorite Voyager episodes, which is kind of horror, called Darkling, and it's when the Doctor had that sub program that was super dark. And at the end of the episode, you don't know if he's really purged himself of that program. That leaves everyone like, man, this guy could come back at any time, you know. And we played some games. I remember a game that we played, which was a Star Trek Adventures module, and it was called Darkness. Really good module. And Al actually was one of the lead players in it because it was a very he's a flight controller at that time. And some of the things we did to create the element is how you describe the setting. And in this case, it was darkness. It was that every step they took, they couldn't see 10 meters ahead of them. And it was pretty riveting. Al, you can speak to it for yourself because you were on the receiving end of that. But that episode to me still, when I picture it, it's very dark when we played the game. And it had a sad ending too. It didn't necessarily have a ha ending. And I consider that one of our best horror episodes.
You know, I agree with everything you said about, especially when you're playing with new players. I know when I go to conventions, I never do horror, or even certain tense situations, even like something like a superhero game that I've run a few times. That even then I have to kind of be careful and scale it back and make sure I don't do anything too stressful, or be careful I don't exactly bring up a situation where people become very uncomfortable. So that's definitely if you're playing with new players, especially, definitely talk to them about uh, what kind of game you're setting up. You know what, horror has a really huge umbrella. It could be there's so many different types. There's, besides gore, there's also like folk horror, which tends to be the so that's coming back into popularity again with like movies like Midsummer and similar movies like that. Um, so let's say you talk to the group. Oh, go ahead.
No, I actually want to talk about that before you skip off of that. I think it's good for people who are listening to know how wide the range of horror is, because for me, I'm not a blood and guts kind of person. Never. Like violence to me, I did a podcast about minimizing violence in games. You may minimize violence, you don't have to minimize horror. So you have a large range to create horror, and I'd like to talk about that because some of the things you could have is disease, which happens a lot in Star Trek. That's horrible when a disease is going through, and those diseases could even be things that, for instance, I'll call them cybernetic diseases, things that are plaguing the ship in the way of virus that could compromise the health and safety of your crew. So putting players on a timeline to fix something before they figure out that they're sucked into space or they freeze to death. These are timelines that you can get really people antsed up, especially when their loved ones are in danger. We know that generally the main characters have plot immunity, so the players kind of need to know that you're not out there to kill them. But you know what? By building early on threads where they have loved ones, families, friends that are on the ship or are about to be affected, and they know their NPCs do not have plot immunity, that can really engage players.
Do you feel the same way, Al?
Yeah. I think that is a very good way to engage everyone. I do think that like there are certain types of horror that that are easier to present to a group of people, right? Like the whole Universal Monsters thing was all about, you don't know if the person sitting next to you is the werewolf, right? You don't know if the person sitting next to you is the vampire, right? So, I think that like you could do little simple things like that to build tension where people might be subconsciously questioning each other. Um, even though realistically maybe none of them have that element that you're plugging in at all, but it doesn't mean that their characters aren't processing, well, maybe the commander over there, he's got that bluegill in his head, like you just don't know. And I think that that's probably like one of the easiest ways to slide in some thriller slash horror elements to a story.
I I've been trying to create a game with not just with Star Trek, but in general, and I've been having difficulty with. There's an episode of Star Trek Next Generation called Parallels with Worf, and to me, that's also a very frightening episode. At least very very tense because you're dealing with like don't like your sense of reality keeps getting distorted and change and what your foundation is, you know, with your friends and where you're living at and your family. It keeps drastically changing each time something. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. It keeps changing it whenever something happens. So I agree with you. You don't have to be scary. You know, you have to go for
Well,
scare.
yeah, and along the same veins, another TNG episode that really got me, and I thought it was so constructed well, like a stage play. And in fact, that was the buildup that it was a stage play, was when Riker, the episode Frame of Mind, where he was imprisoned by aliens and he's disassociated from reality and what stage play, and these elements keep melding together. That was a brilliant episode, similar to Parallels, where this was horrible. He was in a horrible situation. And you could actually, if you could talk to your players, like sometimes I'll take a couple players aside and I say, hey, I'm writing this story. Are you willing to play along to create some horror? And this character is going to take the brunt of it. I know Al's one of my best conspirers on that. We lost his character for like 3 episodes. They all thought he was dead to create some horror. And if you can, as a game master, do that, you can create, Emmanuel, like episodes, Manny, episodes where the Worf character, whoever's that player character, doesn't know that the other player character is going to be acting along with you as the GM. And you can create some really fun scenarios that way that become super memorable games.
Yeah, I'd just like to put a plug in for Monty Cook Games has a really cool checklist that you can give your players. And it basically goes through like all the different potential horror elements that could show up in a story. And the characters say, well, I would be comfortable role playing that. I would be comfortable if that happened off screen, or I'm not comfortable with that at all. I found that thing and fell in love with it immediately. And I've seen it passed around quite a bit on the internet. But it's a good way to get the pulse of your players, and to see what sort of little strings you can pull. Now, once you've built that level of trust, like Michael and I have, you can start doing more and more stuff with your players once they know that you're not out to get them, that you're just trying to tell a cool narrative.
Yeah, I like what Al said too about not knowing who the monster is. I think the way to ruin a good horror story is by letting them know in Act 1 or Act 2 who the monster is. That ruins the suspense. That ruins the tension. Because honestly, just like in real life, players' imagination is far worse than anything you were planning to do with them. So if you just build an Act 1 and Act 2 and don't let them know what the problem is, believe me, they're paranoia, and you just sit there like, maybe, that's a great way to build up suspense. So hide the monster if possible.
Sometimes I don't like in real life when I'm playing a role-playing game with someone, use real riddles, like because sometimes they just won't get it, what if I've had that happen once and I spent like hours and they just ruined the game. So what I've done is I use the mechanics of the game so that their characters can roll to see if they got the riddle, I realized you can also do that when it comes to horror. You don't have to like try to scare your players. It's really the characters in the story that have to be really scared or tensed up. Um, how would you use the mechanics of the game to help do that? Have you used that?
So I've been recently prepping some Achtung Cthulhu to run at my store, and the awesome thing about the 2D20 system is that like across the board, rules are pretty much applicable to all the different games. And I was like, okay, so they do a lot with like mental horror and like mental faculties disappearing and whatnot. And I was going to talk about that, and then I was flipping through this happy book, the Game Master Guide, and I got to page 212 and 213, where it talks about mental attacks, and it says that instead of having a physical beatdown with a batlet, characters can try to wear each other down mentally, and literally just because it's all goes to stress, but it's just a different type of attack, and there's different. It talks about different resistances that you can have, like if you've got a high morale at that time, or maybe if your XO just gave you the direct task, how you would have resistance against a mental attack. So that's one way. I know that people that like to use the old ones like to use like people going crazy and things like this, but this is one way to kind of like manage it in the same system. It's still just an attack. You use a slightly different resistance to that attack, and it comes off of your stress as normal. So that's one way that you can keep track of this type of stuff. So that's I think that's one option. The other option is fatigue. And I don't know if you guys have followed up on the fatigue rules or anything like that, but it's also right here on page 213, where it's talking about when you take a point of fatigue, that means that you're worn out mentally or physically. So if something is scaring you, something is stressing you out, you can have the players take fatigue. And basically what that does is it lowers your maximum stress value by 1. And if your maximum stress value ever lowers to 0, then you just you pass out because you're too scared, essentially. So I think that both of those ideas could be a way to actually use mechanics to build the horror type feel.
I have the favorite mechanic I use to build tension and fear in my players, and it's aptly named is threat. So what I'll do is in acts 1 and 2, I will pile it on and not spend it. I will pile it up. The most we've ever collected, I think, is I've had 41 points of stress. And it was a horrible episode in that they were stuck in a subspace tunnel, and these creatures that were coming after them were not going to be easily defeated. It was a module that Tony Pye, one of our contributors on Continuing Mission, had written. And I remember they were like, when are you spending this threat? And it translated into their characters' desperation. Like, we can't fight these people. We need to get out of here. And when it came down, if they started getting a little bit comfortable, I would toss 10 points down, boom, just and show them you are dealing with a force you cannot handle right now. So that mechanic there, Manny, is pile on the threat, let them know it's getting darker, colder, scarier, more hissing in the background, more noises they don't know. That's how the threat pool represents to me. Like act 3, you're going to have a hard time. And I like that mechanic.
So in your opinion, I'm going to shift the topic just a little bit. Let's look into like what makes space scary. Before I answer that, let me have you both answer it first. What is it about space that, even though we want to explore it, also we also have a sense of fear about it?
It's funny. I think we've talked about this before, Alan, in a different interview, but people are more afraid of going in a submarine than into space. Like, if you think about just the idea of getting to a claustrophobic submarine and go down 5 miles and the creatures you see, and knowing that any malfunction means instant death, that's space. I mean, so even though they look real comfortable on the Enterprise, especially Picard's Enterprise, and they look like, we call it the love boat in space, they're 1 second away from death at any time. And I think it's actually very important for players to realize that. So weaving into episodes that, you can't make mistakes in space. And that alone, if your players don't understand that, then you need to have an episode just focused on that. So they really appreciate that they're in a cocoon, a life shell, trying to get from point A to point B. But it's a fearsome thing if you really think about it.
Yeah, and I think to follow that up, I think it's like the fear of the unknown. Like, yeah, we're all wanting to be explorers and to be discoverers and things like that, but what we don't know is often a terrifying thing in our head. So just something from a bizarre particle that you saw, that you've detected flowing through space that doesn't normally exist there, that can be scary if you describe it and play it up correctly and have it interact with the players or the ship in a way that they don't suspect.
Yeah, things they don't understand. To back that up, is like, have a creature or something that does not communicate any way like we communicate, and it's not going to change. And that alone can create a disjointed feeling, because most players will fall into, okay, these people are beyond us. And that's a horrifying prospect sometimes when, for instance, if you have a creature we just played a game recently where the creature's sole purpose was to procreate through metamorphosis using bodies, and that's all they ever knew. So they needed a host body in order to come to be, and the players, when they figured that out, were like, oh no, and it wasn't going to stop. The creatures could not exist without this function, and that creates a level of horror, meeting these creatures that just don't operate at all like we do.
But has there been anything, maybe that's not just antagonists, but maybe hazards in Star Trek that, like when you think about it, always tenses you up, like maybe from a special episode or a movie or a book?
The Borg.
Yeah.
I mean, they're horrible. There's no beating the Borg. And we talked about it on some other podcasts before, that if you're a game master and your players are easily beating the Borg, then you're actually not playing the Borg correctly. You're not creating the horror. You're not amping up the horror level. If you look at the stats that Aaron Paulier, he wrote the stats in the Discovery Guide, no, in the Delta Quadrant book, all the Borg stats on the ships. These are ships you cannot take out in a fight. And that creates horror, just knowing that all of a sudden in the same sector you detect the Borg. Everybody on that ship should be trying to figure out how to get away from it. So you've got instant dread right there, just looking at those mechanics there,
Yeah, I think the Borg are cool, almost like a zombie parallel, like if you really think about, if you want to attribute it to horror. I think that, like, equally so, the Undine were very terrifying once they showed up and blew up a Borg cube with a tiny little ship. You know what I mean? So I think that they're equally terrifying. The trilateral stature is very bizarre, and I think that they are, and I think fluidic space in general is very terrifying, because it's so different than what we know. So that type of stuff, I know it was only like 4 episodes of Voyager, but I really fell for that.
Yeah, and if you take it to the Coda novels, I don't know if either of you had the chance to finish the Coda novels. That Dayton Ward, David Mack, the third person just failed me on it, but the protagonists in there, the antagonists, they were from Star Trek: The Next Generation, the episode where the little energy modules were getting sucked into their heads. I just forgot their names, but that was a terrifying trilogy, if you had a chance to read it, called Coda. And it's knowing that your actions could mean the collapse of everyone you know and love, and destroy your very universe. These are real Star Trek level common themes, and the way they dragged it out, so you're seeing all the little timelines collapse and all your loved ones and favorite characters die. One of the good things in a game you could do as a game master is, why don't you write the end of Spock your own way? Or why don't you write the end of Voyager characters your own way in a game? Scare your characters if all of a sudden B'Elanna Torres dies at the beginning of Act 1. Bring in major characters that they love, and boom, use those and freak your character like, wow, this is a heavy game. And I felt Coda did that really well. I'm not going to give any more spoilers about it, but it's just that buildup. Again, you don't have to attack the players, but attack their environment, change their world, because they want to be stable. They love their world, right? And when you threaten that, that creates a really big aspect of horror.
And if you want to go back to the Universal Monsters comparison, like the Changelings, if you find out that on your ship, one of the 100 changelings that were sent out is on your ship somewhere, who is it? You know what I mean? Like, I think that Battlestar Galactica did a great job with that in season 3, who the final 5 Cylons were, right? That was like kind of the big subplot that was going on through that season. And I think you could do the same thing and build the same suspense if you know that somebody on your ship is a changeling, but you don't know who, you know.
Mm. I'll share because you both actually took some of my options. But there's one. I don't know if you remember. I think Schism from Next Generation. I think that to me is probably not just scary, but also a great mystery as well. Like the build up to finding out who they are. I think if they would have revealed that in the beginning, it would have been like, oh, okay, all right. But the fact that this mystery that they built up, I think that was just such a masterwork of writing. Something that I try to do for my games as well.
But there's a reason I don't know if any of you recognize the picture behind me, but that's from an Enterprise episode called Dead Stop. And when I thought of horror, if anyone doesn't know the plot, the Enterprise finds this alien space station that's more than happy to make repairs. And it's fixing up their ship wonderfully. But all of a sudden, they start finding out that there's an insidious dark side to it, especially when they find a room full of different bodies from different species. And that's one of my favorite Enterprise episodes, because you think, oh, this is great. Maybe they'll have this, this space station every single episode. What a great boon. But there's a dark side to it. So give your players something cool that they're all celebrating, and then start twisting it out a little bit. It could even be Moriarty style, but there's ways to, again, it's all about I'm going to go back to what Al was saying. Don't let them know who the monster is, but let them start suspecting it in the first 2 acts of your game. Once the reveal happens, then they figure out, oh man, I'm in deep. It's kind of like when Picard and Data figured out that they were actually in the Moriarty program. Now they're like, oh my god, that was the act 3 at that point. So you could do a lot of fun with that. Save that threat, make them do some extended tasks to figure it out, puzzle it out. You're talking about riddles. I translate riddles into extended tasks, where each level of the extended task, they get some information along the way that helps them answer the riddle. And it's funny, players actually feel satisfied, like they actually figured it out because of that. So that's one way to break down riddles with the mechanics.
And you can totally even do the big monster type horror. And I think of like Armis, right? That's kind of a horror element, right? This is the collection of all evil from a species, essentially, right? and it's technologically better than you, and it actually kills a member of your crew. Like, I think that like you can do it if you weave it into a more science fiction type frame as well.
Yeah, you can. I'm gonna just so now we're riffing off episodes. So no, it's really good because I'm thinking about all the different ways to construct it. So I was saying Act 1 and Act 2, don't let them know there's a monster, but then you can in Act 1 reveal the monster. I think about Discovery, Context for Kings, where they go onto the ship and bodies are mangled and twisted, and actually Act 3 reveals that there's not a monster at all. You're the monster. Oh, that was like really cool how they twisted that, and they make the tardigrade the hero in that sense. So there's different ways to do it. Start with some shocking imagery at the beginning and have them reveal who the real monster is, which is normally themselves, could be themselves, which is really sad and scary.
Star Trek Adventures, the role-playing game. For anyone that may have trouble constructing something with a lot of tension, is there any books from that line would you recommend?
I'm gonna plug Al. I'm gonna plug. He wrote 2 different mission brief modules, which you could really build into scary. And I played through some of them, and they are. One's called Anomalies, so you don't know what you're dealing with. And then recently he did Psychic Incursions, and he did a really good job. When I use those, or he uses them on us, you just don't know what you're getting, and you're not sure if pure science is going to solve it, or is this a mental thing, or is this an archaeological thing, and that again creates that tension that the players don't know the answer at first. And of course, humans always think the worst, so they freak themselves out. You don't need to freak them out. So anomalies and psychic incursions, I would have to plug those two. That they're the most malleable for scary mission briefs.
Yeah, and I'll plug you right back too on the Utopia Planitia stuff, because we talk about space being scary, right? And we've got mining operations and salvage operations, right? And so you build in, you've got little rules in there for the different types of things that you might be mining, or how you might scavenge a derelict ship, and you start that at your base, and then you start building upon it by adding, this is where you add a unique alien. This is where you might add, an enemy ship that's bearing down on you. Things like that. I think are good ways to pace your way through a mission when you're talking about a 3-act formula.
Yeah, and there's also some free modules out there too, Manny. One of the writers, he goes by ELH, and he actually wrote an entire bunch of horror modules that you can find on continuing missions. If you type in ELH and horror, there's actually ones that are just bent toward that, and those are they're way more detailed than mission brief. So there's a lot of free stuff out there too. I'm going to plug him because we played one and it was kind of scary. Those are some good ELHs. I will have to say, if you look at that, you're going to get some good guidelines. The one I always rave about, though, I will say it's one of my favorite modules of all times. I plug it every time I can. And Christopher Bennett wrote one called Callback Yesterday. And the potential for horror in that one is really good. That's one that you can purchase at Modiphius. But that really affected my crew big time. And again, it was their minds going off into different tangents, which was scarier than anything I could have ever written.
Yeah, and in addition, I think that you could take the Tilly Call from the Shackleton book and create an entire horror campaign out of them, right? If you make them almost like these silent manipulator, almost ghost-like figures, I think that you could easily take that book and just shift a couple of things and tweak a couple of environments and whatnot, and have a really tight horror campaign.
Can you tell we play a lot, Manny?
The adventures you mentioned in the beginning, is that PDFs only? Is that found through the Continuing Missions website?
They're free. Actually, the ones we talked about from like the mission briefs, psychic incursions, and all the mission briefs, you go to Modiphius, type of mission briefs, they're all free downloads. So those are like the best deal you can.
And we have what, 7 of them now? 6 or 7 of them out now?
Yeah, I think 7 right now. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. I'll put a link in the description below.
Each one has 10 one-page missions essentially, that kind of guide you through just the skeleton, and then you plug in or use it however you wish within your campaign.
Yeah. And I'll always plug the social media too. If people go onto either Discord or Facebook or Reddit and they ask hey, I want to make this scary, or do you have any ideas? The response from social media is like always amazing, including a lot of creators and writers. Jim Johnson from Modiphius is always over there. Nathan Dowdell is always out there, the designer of the game. So I've really found out, I try to send questions that my players don't see if possible when I'm prepping campaigns, but you get a lot of feedback if you're trying to build a game or a special campaign. There's a lot of experts out there willing to help.
Excellent. So this has been a great conversation. Before we wrap up, is there any last words, any last thoughts?
I'll go first. Al pulled out that book, The Game Master's Guide, which came out from Modiphius 2 years ago, or maybe 2021, early 2021. And my biggest thing is respect your player group. So build the trust, establish your rules, your code of conduct for your group, find out what they're acceptable in the way of gore, in the way of violence, in the way of horror, all those kind of mind control that, and then ask them to trust you. And then be good to your players, reward them for playing with you, and even stop a couple times during the game if it's getting really deep and check with everyone, like, is it all right? Are you all right? Can you trust me a little bit longer? But you do want to check in, and once you go through that a couple times with your players, they're going to know that you're not out to kill them, and they're going to help you write a great story. They'll fall forward into the action. So that's my only thing, is Game Master's Guide outlines that in detail. But if you really want to do a horror game, make sure everyone's going to feel good at the end of it, even if it's scary.
Yeah, and I'll echo a little bit about what Michael said, but I really liked how you said that this is a story that we're writing together. And I think that horror is such a unique way of telling a story. It should never really be a gotcha, right? Because that can put a sour taste in some players' mouths, right? So obviously, if you have been playing with the same group for more than a year and you've got that level of trust, that's when you can start building that stuff in. But I would caution anyone from just springing it on a group of people without them knowing. And I think that you can learn a lot about a character if you put them through a moment where they're scared, right? And that's really what we're talking about when we're playing Star Trek Adventures, is how does your character develop? How do they act? How do they react when things aren't exactly the way they think they should be, right? So you're pushing the characters to their limits mentally, and challenging them to work through their fears. And I think that that's a really important piece if you wish to run a horror campaign.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll add is, you can do this online, but you can't really do it effectively around the table. And on Discord, we're able to separate our players in some forums. And so being alone is the worst fear of most people. So if you're able on an online platform to separate out one player and leave them alone, that's scary enough. Sometimes that's all you need, is the creaking sounds and really good descriptions of the area, and they can't find their friends and their communicator's not working. Play around with that maybe at first. Go soft shoe on them, But again, that only works really on a electronic, an online environment, if you can separate people into different rooms.
The only last thing I'll add is that if you have players who are new to Star Trek and you want to show them something quick being like 45 minutes, something a little bit more modern, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, I think does a great job, and it's just came out, and each episode is enough that you kind of, I think you teach game masters how to frame stories just from that. I would say Discovery and Picard, but they're like long season story arcs, and that might be tough to emulate. But Strange New Worlds, I'll definitely recommend, because there's some episode like, whoa, this is pretty creepy.
Yeah,
although
for sure.
funny enough, as much as I try to make my games like as serious as Strange New Worlds, it ends up becoming more like Lower Decks. But
yeah, I think Lower Decks hasn't really had a scary episode yet that I can think of. But, oh no, actually, I'll give it for the one when they went to the medical clinic. I was scared going into it, like, what are we about to see? And they had all these weird people who had all these accidents, and at the end there was that Act 3 humorous reveal. But that was a pretty scary episode.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you both for taking part in this really fun conversation. So again, if you're looking at this at Really Dicey, you can find them at, I'll put the link to the YouTube channel, Continuing Conversations.
Yep, that's on Podbean. They can get us there, on YouTube at Continuing Conversations.
And of course, if you're watching this on that channel, you could feel free to check out my channel, Really Dicey.
Well, I do watch you, so just so everyone knows, it's gold stuff. Especially I love all your Star Trek Adventures based podcasts too. It's great.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate that. So yes, everyone, take care, live long and prosper. We'll see you soon.